a quick introduction, and then we'll turn it over to Josie to get us started. So today's talk, Posada, Printmaker for the People, explores the work of José Guadalupe Posada, a prolific printmaker who worked in Mexico City in the late 19th and early 20th century. It is estimated that he created over 20,000 images in his lifetime. One of his more recognizable images, the Calavera, maintains popularity today through a wide range of popular arts, including Grateful Dead posters and Day of the Dead merchandise. The exhibition, José Guadalupe Posada, legendary printmaker of Mexico, is currently on view at the museum. Today's talk will be given by Josie Lopez, the curator of art at Albuquerque Museum, where she has been employed since 2018. She previously worked with the museum on the exhibition, The Carved Line, Block Printmaking in New Mexico. Currently, she is organizing upcoming traveling exhibitions and collaborating with curators to realize an online exhibition featuring the permanent exhibition, Common Ground Art in New Mexico. Prior to her curatorial position at Albuquerque Museum, Josie curated contemporary exhibitions including Puerto Rico, Defying Darkness, Currency, What Do You Value, and Species in Peril along the Rio Grande. Josie completed her PhD at the University of California, Berkeley. Her dissertation on the Mexican lithographer Constantino Escalante considers 19th century caricature and visual satire of Mexico, France, and Spain. Her research interests include examining art as a discursive agent in the political arena, the intersections of art and the environment, modern and contemporary Latin American art, 19th century France and Mexico, and the history of New Mexican art. She has also taught courses on modern Mexico, the Prince of Francisco Goya, the history of printmaking, and European art. So Josie, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you for today's program. Josie, we need you to unmute.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Okay,
great. If you have any technical issues with being able to hear or see, you can probably check in with Elizabeth in the chat. I feel like I'm speaking into a void as I'm looking into a camera and I can't really see all of you, so it's a much less interactive experience, but I'm pleased that we're able to gather today and to talk about one of the most important printmakers in Mexico. Before we jump into José Guadalupe Posada, though, I wanted to sort of preface some of the work that we're going to be doing today by also talking about some of my research. At the time when I started looking at 19th century Mexican caricature and satire, I was really getting into the writing of my dissertation in around 2015. And that was really at a moment when it was particularly challenging because that was when the attacks on the Charlie Hebdo satirical newspaper from France had occurred. And I think that event really shocked the world in many different ways in terms of the way that it was essentially putting on display how important the press is and how important freedom of press is. And so at that time, it was pretty, the work that I was doing in my research became incredibly relevant for the specific moment that I was doing that work. And based on what has happened in the last few days in this country, I think that we are again in this place where we are looking at how are we looking at freedoms and what does freedom of speech mean? What does freedom of speech encourage in terms of the way that people behave in society? And how important is it that we have an understanding of the limits to freedom of speech. And so I think those are all interesting questions that are in the back of my mind that come up again as we begin to talk about this. So before we jump into José Guadalupe Posada and really delve deeply into his work, I do want to lay down a little bit of a framework that we can use when we think about visual caricature and satire as we look at these images. So one of the things that's really important to think about when you're looking at visual caricature and satire are some of these key points. So the relationship between journalism and politics, and we'll talk a lot about that as we go through some of the prints that are specifically political. The emergence of lithography and different kinds of printmaking techniques that occurred in Mexico during the two time periods that we're going to talk about today. Censorship. One of the most important things that determines the kinds of images that these printmakers would have made really depended on the amount of censorship that was present at that particular historical moment. So we are going to look, before we jump into Posada, we're going to look a little bit at a precursor printmaker whose name was Escalante, Constantino Escalante. And we're going to be able to have a comparison point between the strenuous censorship that existed during Posada's time period versus the less strenuous censorship that existed during Escalante's period. The simultaneous emergence of the bourgeois class and the breakdown of old political and economic systems, as well as the tension between these classes. We're going to see that in particular when we jump into the Posada images and we compare his earlier work with the work that he did during the time of the Mexican Revolution. The emergence of a modern public urban sphere, demonstrating how people were engaging with these prints in a very public kind of way. And also the last thing when we look at these prints is keeping in mind the tension between realism, portraiture, and popular print culture. And so these are some of the ideas that we're going to explore as we look at these prints. So here are the definitions of visual satire. So everyone should go ahead and read these, and we're going to have a quiz in a few minutes. No, I'm just kidding. If you ever present on Zoom or PowerPoint, try not to include slides like this. I just show it to you as an example of how complex visual satire is. Rather than have us read through this, I actually want to go through a little exercise with a more contemporary print or cover actually of the New Yorker, just to get at some of the major points that were made in that previous satire. So what are some of the things that you will find in visual caricature and satire? First of all, there's usually some kind of an exaggeration. You can see here that in the Obama figures, their heads are much larger than their bodies. So there's this kind of exaggeration or diminution that's going on as either a way to fold in some kind of humor or wit or critique. Usually, caricature and satire is historically specific. There are a few printmakers like Posada, like Goya, like Honoré Daumier, the French printmaker, and artist, who really transcend the historical specificity. And we're going to talk a lot about that more later as we get into Posada. But for the most part, caricature and satire is embedded within a specific moment. As I already said, there's often some kind of wit and humor involved. And all of these components work together to reveal some kind of an underlying truth. Now, if you all remember when this New Yorker cover came out, there was really a lot of debate about whether or not this was racially, culturally appropriate. And I think one of the reasons why this particular cover failed in some ways is really based on this idea of revealing an underlying truth. So for one portion of the population, it's clear that what's being depicted in this New Yorker cover is completely ridiculous, right? To assume that Michelle Obama was this revolutionary sort of figure, emulating an Angela Davis kind of approach, with Obama being depicted as a Muslim. And you can see in the background, you know, the connection to Osama bin Laden. Obviously, for the artist who created this image, he was revealing that it's ridiculous to think about the Obamas in this way. But one of the reasons why there was such backlash, and I'm not going to get into sort of the racial underpinnings of why, you know, there should have been that backlash, but another component of that was that it wasn't clear which truths were being revealed, because you actually had another portion of the population that believed that this image was actually a true depiction of the Obamas. So this is how, you know, tricky visual caricature and satire can be. And for it to be successful, it really takes a lot of work to make sure that the viewer is getting that particular revolution, or not revolution, but realization of what it is that the artist is trying to reveal. Oftentimes, visual caricature and satire is critical. The artists are definitely taking sides, but again, their agency depends on the particular time and the circumstances in which they're producing their work. And finally, the artists who have endured over time transcend their particular moment and also create images that become more universal. And again, we'll talk about that more when we jump into the Posada images. So Constantino Escalante was a lithographer who started creating lithographs for a publication called La Orquesta in Mexico City in 1861. In the 1860s was really the period when the first indigenous president, Benito Juarez, comes to power. It was also a moment of relatively free press. So there was less censorship that these newspapers had to contend with. So you have this explosion of newspapers in Mexico City during this time period. And a lot of them happened to be really telling the position, the side of the liberal faction of the politicians of Mexico. So in the 1860s, there was this real battle for not only political power, but also the national identity of Mexico between liberals and conservatives. The liberals really wanted to create a modernized sovereign Mexico, whereas the conservatives really believed that they wanted to go back to some of the colonial structures that had ruled Mexico in the past. And so they were looking to Europe to be the leaders and to really wanted to reinvigorate those colonial ties. And so the liberal faction, who really were a lot of these politicians, were also journalists and were really creating these kinds of newspapers that were making the case. In this case, you can see here Constantino Escalante with his lithographic pen, and Carlos Casarin with his plume. He was one of the editors of the newspaper of La Orquesta. And what's fascinating about looking at those particular, these particular images is that a lot of the editors were also politicians. And so there was this real agency that was being imbued in these images that they were creating during that time period. As I mentioned, Benito Juarez became the president during this time, and he was really the president who came to be known for creating an ideal for the nation that indicated that it was a nation ruled by law. So for much of the time period that he was president, he was really trying to advance these constitutional approaches to governing. And there were a couple of different constitutions that were created in Mexico. And in particular, you'll see in a lot of these images that we'll be looking at, you'll see actual images of the Constitution of 1857 that Juarez was continually trying to promote, as he believed that there needed to be a stronger federal government as opposed to a very strong states' rights type of government. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective of Mexican history, Benito Juarez's rule was actually interrupted by the occupation of the French Empire. And so when Benito Juarez came into office, there was this huge debt that was owed to Great Britain, France, and Spain. And each of those countries were sort of debating about how they were going to collect that debt from Mexico. France, who was led by Napoleon III at the time, decided that they really wanted to go back in and reconquer what had this Latin American nation. And so they attack, and they end up placing the Austrian Archduke Emperor Maximilian in that particular position. So the period of Maximilian and Carlotta is really a fascinating moment in Mexican history, and it's become, and you'll see this later when we look at some of Posada's images of this time period, that the whole country becomes fascinated with that time period. But at the end of the day, Maximilian doesn't ever end up gaining very much support or traction of the Mexico people. Also, Benito Juarez continues to gain in popularity, and ultimately is able to retake the country, and it gains independence again. Of course, Maximilian ends up being executed, which is something we'll talk about in a minute when we look at those Posada images of that particular event. But in this print here, you can see again where Escalante's satirical view of society is really at play. It's called, this particular print is El Mundo al Revés, right? The world upside down. So instead of sitting in the presidential chair, you can see here that Juarez is actually being pinned down. The chair is sitting on him. You can see over here in the background, there's Constantino Escalante, but instead of him making a caricature of Juarez, Juarez is making a caricature of him. And so there are all of these fun and different kinds of depictions of what is happening in Mexico at the time. This kind of figure who's being, instead of smoking a cigar, is being smoked by the cigar. He was one of the businessmen who was actually promoting the development of the railroad at the time. So as I mentioned, Escalante did have relatively a free press, not the whole time, but a lot of the time. The newspapers did suffer some censorship, but pretty much throughout his career, he was able to depict actual political figures. And so you can see here, you can't see their faces, but it's very easy to identify that this is Benito Juarez and his cabinet. And this was in a time period when they were trying to invoke some of the constitutional laws in order to strengthen the federal government. And so the reason I show this print though is because even though Escalante was very much embedded in his own historical moment, he was also looking at other artists. So for example, if you take a look at this particular print on the left by Escalante, and next to it is a print by Francisco Goya. And it's a common trope in a lot of these satirical prints, but it's basically a barbershop. And in this case, it's Juarez who's giving the priest a trim, because one of Juarez's goals was to privatize a lot of the lands that were owned by the church. In the Goya print, though, these are much more sort of types rather than individual specific political figures. And so you have a young man who's sort of being fleeced by these women. In this case, you can see how Goya's image has ultimately become a more universal. Here again is another comparison between Goya and Escalante. In the Dream of Reason, this becomes a very much a universal kind of print that gets looked at over time. Whereas in Escalante's print, you would really kind of have to know who those figures are in order to determine what's happening or what's going on in that particular image and what the critique is that Escalante is advancing. Another artist who really does come into play in terms of Escalante's visual language is Honoré Daumier, who's French. And some of you may say, well, what was he doing looking at these French artists? Well, again, with the occupation of France, there was actually quite a circulation in Mexico City of French newspapers and French prints. And so this is an example of a print that probably resonates pretty well today. This is the French legislature, and you can see here where a few of them are sort of making deals in the corners. Many of them are sort of taking naps and snoozing. This was very much Daumier's critique, of the legislative belly is the title of this. So the connections that you can see between Daumier and Escalante, for example, here is Daumier's Gargantua, which shows politicians climbing up and feeding the king, Louis Philippe. And then, of course, he's excreting on the other side favors that they have purchased. And so you have a similar situation where you have a figure in Mexican politics who, again, is being, fed or bribed by particular political figures. Here's another example of Escalante and Daumier, overlapping, but here's Napoleon III. And you can see very similar kinds of exaggerations, poking fun at, can he fill in these large boots? And also, can he, the hat is something that he's also not filling. So this sort of diminishing of the figure is where the critique lies in this particular image. But here again, you can see some of the ways in which Escalante was really engaging with artists like Daumier and Goya. We're going to see now, as we jump into Posada's work, that there's a real difference in the way that Posada approached creating his works of caricature and satire. And there's a couple of different, reasons for this. It was a different time period. There were different levels of censorship, but it was also Posada's approach to the way that he was engaging with the Mexican people and how his works tended to be more popular in nature. Of course, at the end of his life, the emergence of the Mexican Revolution also impacted what he depicted and how he depicted it. But there were literally, many, many years and the bulk of when he was producing prints where it was a much more of a popular engagement with society. That's not to say that he wasn't political at all. In fact, there are many scholars who have spent a lot of time looking at his more politically driven imagery. But I think that it's much broader than that, based on how much work that he produced, and also based on the relationship he had with the commercial print shop that he worked for. So what were the conditions in Posada's Mexico? After Benito Juarez regains power from France, there are a few leaders that come in between, but around 1876, really, Porfirio Díaz takes power in Mexico. And he essentially becomes, this figure that is present for the next 35 years. He's very much more of a dictatorial style of leadership. And so there were very limited press freedoms at the time because of his power and control. Also, during this time, though, interestingly, it was a huge level of modernization within Mexico. So it was the development of economic development, getting foreign investors to come in and participate. There was huge developments around mining and the creation of the railroad. And so, the concept of liberalism that it developed in Juarez's period becomes this real push toward economic development and prosperity. While that's good for some elites in Mexico, it really leaves behind many of the rural Mexicans. And of course, those are the conditions that ultimately lead to the Mexican Revolution, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So jumping into Posada, you can see in this photograph, he is standing outside of the printmaking workshop. If any of you have visited Mexico City, there is a sort of a square block that's near where the Templo Mayor is, where you can actually see where these old workshops had existed. And these were, they were very popular. People would come in and buy these penny press broadsides and different kinds of printed material. And so we'll talk about a lot of that popular printed material as we go through Posada's prints. But in addition to that popular material, you can also see that even though it was not quite at the same level of the Escalante print that we saw earlier that was describing the La Orquesta, you do still see that Posada was very much engaged in depicting the press. So this one is called the Calavera de la Prensa. And so it really is kind of showing, the Vanegas Arroyo sort of print workshop where a lot of these printers were working and producing these images. And so this is also, you'll see here in this broadside, this is one of the sort of calaveras that Posada is known for. And this is the imagery that actually would propel him into becoming one of the most popular artists ever in Mexico. And so we'll continually come back to the idea of the calavera. Now, Posada sometimes is credited with being sort of the first person to create calaveras, but really the skeleton has been around, for centuries. You can see, little images of it in Italy, for example, when you visit some of the sites and churches. And so it's not necessarily that he invented the use of these images that respond to or reflect on death, but the way that he uses it is very different. And so he creates his own style of calavera that becomes very much legendary. Some of the other popular examples of how he was sort of also advertising for the press. You can see here in this image, the Imprenta de Vanegas Arroyo, and this is the actual print shop. So you can see the press in the background. You can see the people that are coming in to purchase what's being created. And so that becomes this incredible exchange of visual imagery. One of the things that often gets pointed out is that perhaps one of the reasons why a lot of these kinds of publications were popular is because there was a certain sector of the the populace of Mexico City that didn't necessarily have a high level of literacy. And so the images really helped to sell a lot of these popular penny press kinds of productions. But there were other really interesting prints or publications that were being made. Here's an example called La Felicista. And this is basically a collection of modern songs. So he was creating these pamphlets that were really engaging with all kinds of popular culture, not just the visual and the printing press or the print workshop that we've seen so far. There are also these wonderful sort of collections of books that they did, the chapbooks that they did, and little notebooks. This one is called the Collection de Cartas Amarosas. And so it's these, this collection of love letters, basically, that were written. And there were all kinds of different little books like this that were specifically targeting women. There were particular chapbooks that talked about how to embroider things, and others that included, you know, how-tos of different roles that women played in society. Here's another sort of popular celebration of a popular celebration, basically a popular toast that was being presented. And in this case, you can see how sometimes these were quickly created prints that were done, that, you know, Posada was creating many images like this, you know, a week. And so some of them have a much quicker kind of approach to mark making, while others are much more engaged in sort of a portraiture, and we'll talk about some of those when we get to specific individuals. He also created entertainment. This is a board game called Los Charros Contrabandistas. So, you know, sort of these, the game of the cowboys and the smugglers. And so there's a whole, you know, whole group of works that he was creating that had this kind of approach to music and popular culture and entertainment. Another fascinating element of Posada's work is the way in which he approached making prints. During Constantino Escalante's time, he was really working with stone lithography. And so what's wonderful about lithography is that there is a freeness to it, because you're drawing onto a stone, as opposed to carving into a plate, or carving from away from a wood block. And so what's fascinating about what Posada did is that he tended to use a visual language that looked like a woodblock type print, but he was often using zinc etching, sort of zinc plates, rather than either wood blocks or the lithographic stones. And what that allowed for was a way to transport, obviously more readily, but also a way to print images with text. So if you look at the Escalante images, really they're full page lithographs. They're not embedded within the text. Whereas a lot of Posada's images you see alongside some kind of a text. What you're looking at here is actually the plate of this particular print. And when you see the print itself, one of the things to notice, of course, is that it's flipped, right? So you can see how when the plate is being carved, the artist has to actually take into account when the reversal when the printing is done. And so it's sort of it's always been one of those things that I've been so impressed, you know, that printers have to negotiate that kind of a reversal. As I mentioned earlier, Posada also looked back at some different time periods in history. And you can see in this particular print, there is a reflection on the period of Maximilian, which was also what Escalante was depicting in his images. This was a project that Posada worked with the Mauchi brothers to create. And it was a series of children's books that were done. And you can see here, there's the Emperor Maximilian on horseback. Another book in the series was Los Voluntarios del Bajo de las Hornadas, Heroicas. So these were sort of the heroic Mexican soldiers who stood up and fought against Maximilian. This particular this particular book in the series is entitled El Cinco de Mayo of 1862. And so this was the Battle of Puebla, where Mexico was actually victorious over Maximilian. Of course, the French would go on to defeat Mexico I'm sorry, that they were not victorious over Maximilian. They were victorious over Napoleon III's soldiers. But then, of course, the French would go on to defeat Mexico, and then Maximilian would be put into power. And so that becomes, an iconic moment in the history. And then, of course, here's the famous execution of Maximilian. This was actually the reason why I even started looking at prints in Mexico, is because I was researching and writing about Manet's The Execution of the Emperor Maximilian. If you're not familiar with that painting, it's pretty readily available if you want to look it up. But this is an interesting depiction of looking back at that particular moment. So this image would have been created after Manet's. In addition to the popular broadsides and the games and the music and the children's books and the penny press, Posada also created some religious images. And it's interesting because I have not spent a lot of time researching some of these religious images, but in many cases, they have, they're indicated from the Posada Foundation that they are attributed to Posada. So they're not necessarily signed by him. So it'd be interesting to see and compare some of these works with some of his others. But what you can see here is that there tends to be more realism in terms of the way that these religious figures are depicted. And so this is an example that was published also at the Vanegas Arroyo workshop. And this is the Señora del Refugio. And there are a couple of these included in the exhibition, including, of course, one of the most famous iconic religious images of the Virgen de Guadalupe. And you can see here, this carving is in this particular plate. So you can get a sense of the mark making that was made on the plate itself in order to produce the print. I was asked a question in a talk that I was giving a few weeks ago to our museum docents. And that question was, what was the original sort of visual presentation of the Virgen de Guadalupe? And of course, the legend is that the young man in Mexico who had a vision of the Guadalupe saw her, and she instructed him to go to the priest and tell the priest to build a church for her. And the young man tried to do this and didn't believe, and the priest didn't believe him, and so he comes back and she gives him a cape, and on his cape there is an image of her as well as these roses. And so it was considered, a miracle at the time. So, going back to that original object is really where the sort of the virgin image evolved from. Of course, now we see that image all over the place. It's a somewhat ubiquitous here, certainly in Mexico and New Mexico as well. Another interesting image that I find really kind of fascinating was the Saint Santiago image that is also in the exhibition. And here again, this is a very different kind of approach to creating prints than you see in some of the other work that Posada did, sort of the more realistic rendering of the Saint Santiago, as well as the horse. Though you still see some of the dynamism, that you get to see in many of his other Posada prints. But in terms of the visual language, it's very different than some of the other works that we have been looking at and that we will look at more. And then here again is the carved plate that's included with that religious figure. Another sort of popular culture type of image that Posada created were all of these news events that were sometimes sensational, they were sometimes horrible. There are examples of floods, of people sort of dying in various kinds of ways. In this particular print that you see here on the right, you see that there was a terrible suicide, and this is in the cathedral de la Torre. And so this kind of sensationalist news really demonstrates how much Posada not only was looking at sort of the popular culture in his particular historical moment, but also the events that were happening and that people were really paying attention to. So in a way, it was sort of the print version, of all of our sort of social media kind of news that we're consuming on a regular basis now. And you can see here an example of how much of an impact, how much the legacy of Posada really had, particularly on Mexican artists, in looking at Frida Kahlo's painting of the suicide of Dorothy Hale. And you can clearly see, some of the visual connections that were being made between Frida's painting and, of course, this Posada image. Both Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, in fact, most of the Mexican modernists were very much enamored and influenced and intrigued by Posada's imagery and work. And I'll show you a couple of examples when we get into the section about his legacy. Posada also created these incredible literary figures. And this is just one example that actually became one of his most famous calaveras. This is his image of Don Quixote. And of course, if any of you have studied Don Quixote, you know that that satirical novel became one of the most important novels in terms of both Spanish and Latin American literature, and also the way that it served up as a critique of society. And in many ways, that's what many of these caricaturists and satirists were doing. However, they were doing it visually rather than through literary tropes. And so here you can see, this is one of the reasons why this has become one of Posada's most famous images, is because of the way that he uses the calavera, but also he brings this image to life. There's an incredible vitality, motion, urgency, and almost, comic violence in a way that is being played out as Don Quixote rides through and tramples the other calaveras that are around him. So while many of the works that Posada created were very much involved with the popular culture of Mexico City at the time, he also was engaged in a specific approach to social satire. And one of the things that he did is he really looked at the different strata, the different classes of Mexico City residents, and often, made critiques about the divisions in classes, both within Mexico City and throughout Mexico. One of the images that I really love is the Gran Fandango, which is basically this dance, right? This incredible dance that's taking place. But it does also bring in, this sort of approach to music and culture, and how this is very much embedded and a part of Mexican life in Mexico City. There were also some critiques of the relationship between Mexico and the United States. Here's an example called El Mosquito Americano. This is often interpreted as a critique of the ways in which, particularly Porfirio Díaz, was encouraging foreign investment in Mexico. And of course, US involvement and investment was something that very much was critiqued at the time. Here's the Calavera de los Patinadores, the street sweepers, which also exemplifies what I was talking about earlier, where you can see that the image is actually embedded within a page of text. You can also see how he embellished these little images, these little calaveras throughout the publication as well, adding a visual interest to the other stories that are being presented in this broadside. And then there are the prints that he also did of artists and looking at the world of artists and their role in popular culture. The other element that's interesting that gets presented in the exhibition is that many of Posada's caricatures or prints or figures were actually reproduced over and over for different purposes. So in this case, this is the Gran Calavera Electrica, and you can see here this calavera with these sort of beams coming out of his eyes, and then in the background is this sort of electric train, which is a commentary on the modernization of Mexico City. But then in this very next image, you can see that that same calavera electrica is being used to attack an image of the Ku Klux Klan. And so it's really fascinating the ways in which this sort of social political critique was happening on the one hand in Mexico City, but then that same sort of figure is being utilized to comment and critique, obviously the racial struggle and disparity that was happening in the United States. Another one of my favorite and one of his most dynamic calaveras that gets utilized over and over again is the Calavera Carrancista. Fascinatingly, during the period of modern Mexico that we're looking at, there was this huge, it was all the rage to ride bicycles. And so it was the upper classes who were discovering and using and riding bicycles all around the city. And so you see this sort of comic representation that has sort of the urban kind of dandy with the top hats and the hats with the feathers. And here they are, riding on their bicycles and essentially trampling, the pedestrians who were probably lower classes that Posada is presenting. Here is another incredibly reproduced image of the Calavera Bolshevik. This Calavera has been used in all kinds of different ways. Obviously, when Posada created it in this particular iteration, it was very much engaging with what was happening in Russia. And so again, you'll see this particular Calavera over and over again. And oftentimes it's not even connected to the political, statement that it was originally presented in this particular case. This is, though, one of the most readily, researched and traceable versions of the Calavera. It's a signed image, but we know that there were at least 6 versions of it. There were 3 with dates. The first one was in 1910, then 1913, and then the last one was in 1919, which was post, Posada died in 1913. And so we know that, that in this particular case, we can really track the different iterations of the print. So at the very end of his life, Posada really does engage with the Mexican Revolution. As I said earlier, he dies, relatively early on. As I mentioned before, the Mexican Revolution was really based on a struggle between the idea of the power of a federal government versus the states, the struggle between the Mexico City elites and the rural parts of Mexico. Of course, during the period of Porfirio Díaz, as I've already mentioned, it was this incredible moment of modernization, but it was also considered the afrancesado of Mexico City and Mexico. And so there was a real pushback during the revolution and the post-revolution to say that Europe shouldn't be the center of what Mexico was striving for in terms of imagining their own national identity. And so there was this real return to the idea of the land and who gets to own land, the struggle for a Mexican identity that was embedded within a uniquely Mexican antiquity, meaning looking at the indigenous history of Mexico. And so, of course, Diaz ends up, having to basically give up his dictatorial rule of Mexico. And then one of the things that I will mention before, moving on from Diaz, is that he also utilized a police force that was actually developed during the time of Juarez, but he continued to build and utilize this force called Los Rurales. And they would go into the countryside and make sure that the farmers and the people who were living outside of Mexico City were basically, kept down in terms of not responding to and fighting back against what was happening to them in terms of the way that land was distributed. And so the Los Rurales ended up becoming one of the ways in which the rural communities became incited to rise up and really fight against this dictatorial rule. Once Porfirio Díaz is out of office, of course, things really change in different ways. Francisco Madero was one of the figures who ended up coming into power for a short period. But then we sort of see the escalation of the revolution. And of course, most of us know, the very basic of, Pancho Villa, Zapata, and other figures that really start to form and take over Mexico in different ways. And so this is where you see that Posada is directly engaging with those revolutionary figures. So here's an example of the Emiliano Zapata calavera. And then, of course, another more kind of recognized and famous calavera of Zapata. The only other, and so when we think about the kind of legacy of Posada, the Calavera Catrina, as she's been come to be known, is probably one of the most famous images. You can see here, though, that when she was first created, she was called El Panteón de las Pelonas. And las Pelonas were sort of the upper class women of Mexico City who were cutting their hair short because that was the fashion of the time. So again, this is another one of those images that gets reused in a lot of different ways, but it was initially embedded in this kind of social critique of the classes in Mexico City. And so you'll see her again and again in many different iterations and formats. So what was Posada's legacy? What ultimately, made him become one of these figures that really transcends his period? Because as I said earlier, remember when we were looking at caricature and satire, is that it's really embedded in a specific historical moment. So what is it about Posada that allowed him to really transcend his moment? As I also said earlier, in many ways, because of censorship, he was having to create these caricatures that weren't necessarily depictions of individual political leaders, for example. And so in the same way that Goya had to sort of disguise his social critique in particular types, Posada had to do something kind of similar. And so his calavera becomes a way to kind of disguise those very specific social critiques that he was making of his Mexico City. And so it's those types that become very popular. So you can see here in this particular tequila label advertisement that this is actually, a take on one of Posada's images. You can see here in a much more political way. So yes, a lot of his images are used in commercial ways, but in a much more political way. You can see here that in this particular poster that was created, this is actually using the Don Quixote image that we talked about earlier, but this was actually a poster that was created during the 99%, during the occupation movement in New York. And so you can see here, we are the 99% is trampling these other calaveras that are labeled as the different banks, the different powerful banks, Citibank, Chase. And so, this is a direct, this isn't even sort of this is a direct quote of Posada. Here again, a different play on this is Esther Hornadas created this particular print to critique the kinds of dangerous environments that people who pick fruit are engaged with. And of course, talking about migrant farm workers and how they're being exposed to different kinds of chemicals, just in the very nature of how they do their everyday work. And so this has become a really, interesting way of looking at the Chicano graphic arts movement that has really evolved over time and continues. There's a wonderful exhibition right now that was curated by Carmen Ramos at the Smithsonian that really features these Chicano artists and how they were utilizing posters to also extend, social and political critique. And so again, Posada had, a great impact on a lot of those artists. In Mexico as well, artists like Arturo Garcia Bustos often used the kind of imagery that he saw and emulated it in some of his more political prints. This one is called Huelga Revolucionaria, the strike. Huelga means strike. And then here, La Revolución, and you can see sort of in the bottom right-hand corner, this figure that's sort of reminiscent of some of the Posada figures that we have seen earlier in the presentation. A more contemporary work by El Pinche Grabador, who's from Guanajuato, really takes the idea of Posada and creates his own visual language in the way that he's reflecting on the current moment in Mexico and the violence that's happening in Mexico. So, this says here that you see this very heavily armed soldier. If you've been to Mexico recently, you see that the police force is often this very heavily armed kind of military looking force. And it says here that I promise that I will protect my pueblo against all dangers. And you can see that his gun is pointing at himself. So indicating how, the police are one of the most dangerous elements of, the current moment in Mexico. And this kind of brings us back, full circle to my opening comments around censorship. One of the things that has happened recently in Mexico over the past certainly the past decade, is the life of journalists is incredibly dangerous, and the very act of sort of critiquing and pointing out some of the injustices and some of the violence that is happening in Mexico is something that puts your life in danger. So that is the kind of environment that journalists and visual satirists and caricaturists and political cartoonists are living in. And so again, as I mentioned earlier, sort of the level of censorship within a particular time period really does make it have an impact on what it is a particular artist can depict and how much they have to disguise those depictions within the vestiges of caricature and satire. Of course, one of the most famous murals that was created by Diego Rivera. This is a kind of a riff also on a European idea of a Sunday afternoon in the park. But what you can see here, of course, is Rivera bringing in the sort of Catrina, Calavera that we looked at. Posada is on her, she's flanked by Posada, and then a young Diego Rivera who's standing right in front of an image of Frida Kahlo. So you see this is actually a detail of a huge mural that actually starts with the very beginning of the history of Mexico and goes all the way through you know, to the moment of what was present for Diego and Frida, which was sort of the 1930s. The last image that I will show you, and it looks like we are okay, we're good for time. The last image that I just wanted to talk about a little bit was also one of the most important groups that Posada had great influence on was the Taller de Gráfico Popular. And this particular printmaking workshop was a collective of artists from all over Mexico that really looked at Posada's practice and his images and read them as an important way to engage with the world. And they also saw that they had agency, that the posters that they were creating, the prints that they were creating, were not only speaking to the political environment in Mexico, but they were engaging with political movements all over the world. And so he becomes this incredible figure that becomes a symbol for sort of the avant-garde revolutionary imagery that the Mexican modernists were looking at, but also that later printmakers who were very much about being engaged within the political movements that were taking place at their time. And so he becomes this figure that really contributes to the way that they see their role in their own printmaking and in engaging with Mexico and the people of Mexico. And so really that really is the sort of crux of the title of why we say, you know, the popular culture of Mexico is because Posada really was far-reaching in the way that he was creating this visual language that spoke to the different classes of Mexico, that spoke to the political moment, the economic moment, and then ultimately at the end of his life, the revolutionary moment that ended up completely changing the way in which the political, economic for sure, but also the artistic way of looking at Mexico sort of played out. And I do think that that was one of the reasons why he was such a figure that the modernists adopted, as well as these later political satirists, was because of the ways in which he utilized a quintessentially Mexican visual language to depict and extend the ideas that he was engaging with during his time period. So I think, Elizabeth, I can't see you. I feel like I'm speaking into the void here. But if there are questions, we can actually open it up for questions. I think we can, if you have questions, you can type them in the chat, and then Elizabeth will let me know if we have some questions.
Yes, actually, yes, we do have a question here. Let's see. We have a couple questions. So the first question is, did Posada have assistants helping him etch the plates?
He typically tended to etch the plate himself. There were other artists who did work at the print shop, And actually one of the first artists to create the calavera before Posada, Posada made it his own, but Manuel Mania was one of the other printers at the workshop. And so they would sometimes collaborate on printmaking and on particular plates. But for the most part, it's my understanding that Posada would directly, carve his own plates.
Okay, the next question is, Posada is thought of as being sympathetic to the revolutionaries, perhaps thanks to Diego Rivera and the TGP, but many of his pieces are quite critical of it. How much can we actually attribute to his beliefs versus what was just determined by his publisher and censorship?
That's a great question, and really gets at sort of my in my research and my thinking around Posada is I totally agree that, there have been several scholars who really delve deeply into sort of his depictions of the revolution. But as you point out, unpacking how much of the perception of Posada as being sympathetic to the revolution based on how he gets seen over time, right? Whether it was the Mexican modernists, including Rivera, whether it was the TGP artists. I absolutely agree that, that there really has to be sort of an examination of that. In the same way that Posada was engaging with the revolution itself, he was also critiquing some of those revolutionary figures. It's really kind of funny in working with my assistant curator when we were pulling this project together. If you go see this exhibition at the museum, you'll see that we've created from our photo archives a timeline of the Mexican Revolution. And so my assistant curator, when we did that project, she said, these revolutionaries were really kind of just, there was a lot of violence going on here. And it was a moment when sometimes the idealism of revolution the idealism of the revolution overshadowed some of the actual violence and conflict that was happening at the time. And so I think it's a much more complex view that Posada has. And I think that he was critical in the same way, that Goya was, and the same way that Escalante was, of both the elites and the suspicion, the lower classes, and certainly the revolutionaries as well. So that's a great question. Thank you.
So another question is, can you say a little bit about Posada's images related to the exceedingly common skull and skeleton images we see for Dia de los Muertos or in New Mexico every day?
Yeah, that was another legacy, I think, that came out of some of Posada's images. But don't forget that Mexico has, the concept of death is a very different way. There's a different way of looking at the concept of death in Mexico than we necessarily do here in the United States. And so seeing that figure in many ways as a celebration is different. And so I think that the calavera comes from multiple places. It's not just Posada, but you certainly see a rendering of it as it has taken place over time in different parts of Mexico where Dia de los Muertos is celebrated. And then the version of it that gets celebrated here in New Mexico and in some parts of the United States. Don't forget that Dia de los Muertos is not necessarily, this national holiday. There's certain parts of Mexico where it's very popular. Of course, the movie Coco, I think, also made it very, popular in terms of the broader culture here in the United States. But I think that when you start looking closely at Posada's calaveras, a lot of them are often embedded in, this kind of engagement with social critique on a broad scale. And certainly the calaveras that are presented and used in the Day of the Dead kind of celebrations are much more about that. They're about the celebration.
The next question is, I recognize some of these images as ones I have seen before in the museum. How many of these pieces in the exhibition were imported from other sources?
So the most of what is on display now in the in this particular exhibition is an exhibition that's traveling to us from the Posada Foundation in San Francisco. So the Posada images are all from that foundation's collection. The Constantino Escalante images, which are in bound volumes of the journal La Orquesta, which are also included in the exhibition, are lent to us from the Center for Southwest Research. And I was very lucky that those belong to that collection because those were also a bulk of my research. And so it was really exciting for me to be able to show those. And so we augmented the Posada exhibition also with, like as I mentioned, a timeline of the Mexican Revolution with photographs from the Albuquerque Museum photo archives. So those are really the only objects in this particular exhibition that we have on view in this exhibition. Personally, I would love to continue to grow our collections of Mexican prints. But in New Mexico, probably the largest collection of Posada prints are the broadsides, or are the collection at the Center for Southwest Research at UNM. And I also know that actually I had a short email exchange with Frank Rose, who's going to be doing a Posada exhibition up in Santa Fe at his gallery called Hecho a Mano. So there's Frank, if you're on, give you a little plug there.
Another question, Josie, is in the exhibit at the museum, it said that Posada died penniless. I imagine he was paid very little for his work with Venegas Arroyo. When were his skills as an artist recognized by the greater public in Mexico?
That is a great question also. And I know that we skimmed through a lot of information very quickly, but we don't have a huge amount of information about Posada's history. We do know that he definitely studied art and that his draftsmanship was definitely one that was trained. But he was considered a craftsman, he was working for a sort of a commercial print shop he was quickly producing, thousands of prints that he created over his time with Venegas Arroyo. There's some debate about how much of the imagery that was created was actually determined by Venegas Arroyo and directed toward Posada, or how much of it was actually Posada's opinion or position on anything in particular that was happening. So there has been some argument that, a lot of the positions that we see play out in these images were actually Venegas Arroyo rather than Posada. So I think that that's sort of the debate, because we don't have a huge amount of actual evidence coming out of that time period that can point us in one direction or the other. But he did end up, again, he was paid, small amounts. He ended up being buried in a pauper's grave, so sort of an unmarked grave. It really wasn't until the modernists really celebrated him that he became this massive, well-known figure in Mexico. That being said, his images were everywhere. So even if people didn't know specifically who he was, they would have seen his chapbooks and broadsides and all of this material that he was producing, was ubiquitous, as you can see here in this photograph in this sort of marketplace. His images were everywhere. So even if he wasn't identified necessarily as the artist who was celebrated for making those images, they did become part of the visual popular culture of the time.
Great. I think we've come to the conclusion of our questions. So Josie, thank you so much for today's talk. It was wonderful to dig in deeper to Posada and understand his impact. Just a reminder to everybody, the museum is open for New Mexico residents. We are open our regular hours, which are Tuesday through Sunday, 9 to 5 o'clock. So if you haven't had a chance to see this exhibition, you certainly can come. You just need to buy a ticket ahead of time online. So thanks again, and you all have, yes.
Sorry, just one more thing. Just wanted to let people know that we will be, this next sort of series of exhibitions that the museum is opening are really interesting because it does cover the sort of swath of Mexican art and some of the legacies of Mexican art. So Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera, and Mexican Modernism will be opening at the museum on February 6th. So you can actually see that exhibition alongside the Posada exhibit, as well as a smaller exhibit of works on paper by Luis Jimenez. So it's a really exciting moment where we can sort of see both the development of this history of visual culture, but also how it manifests itself in an artist like Luis Jimenez. So I hope to see you all there.
Thanks again. Have a great afternoon, everyone.